It was the first week of November, the kind where the wind carried the scent of damp earth and dying leaves. The kind where the sun dipped too fast behind skeletal trees, leaving the world in twilight before you were ready. That's how it felt when I first set foot in Black Hollow Cemetery, an old, sprawling graveyard tucked behind the hills of a forgotten town in Pennsylvania. I had come to pay respects to a distant ancestor, or so I told myself. But deep down, it was curiosity that had led me there. Black Hollow wasn't just a cemetery. It was the final resting place of soldiers who had fought in a battle so bloody and bitter that history had tried to scrub it clean. A skirmish that never made it into textbooks, buried beneath more famous wars, more grandiose victories. The kind of battle where men died screaming each other's names, only to be thrown into the same cold ground, forgotten by time. I arrived at dusk, just as the wind picked up, rattling the rusted iron gate that groaned as I pushed it open. The headstones stretched out before me, uneven and cracked, their epitaphs worn to whispers by the wind. I traced my fingers over the letters of names I couldn't quite make out, feeling a strange kind of reverence settle in my bones. That was when I heard it, the low, rhythmic pulse of a drum. At first I thought it was my imagination, some trick of the wind filtering through the trees. But as I stood still, straining to listen, the sound became clearer. A deep, resonant thump, 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 steady and deliberate, like the echo of boots on a battlefield. It was coming from deeper inside the cemetery, past rows of tombstones that seemed to lean toward me, as if urging me to follow. I should have left. Any sensible person would have, but something about that sound, something hollow and aching, pulled me forward. I stepped carefully over tangled roots and forgotten graves, moving toward the heart of the cemetery. The deeper I went, the louder the drumbeats grew, until they were joined by something else. Whispers. Not the rustling of leaves or the sigh of the wind, but voices. Soft, overlapping, speaking names I didn't recognize in a language I didn't quite understand. My breath hitched as I rounded a bend and saw them, rows of headstones, standing shoulder to shoulder like the soldiers they had once been. And among them, shadows. Tall, thin figures shifting in the moonlight, flickering like candle flames in a draught. They weren't solid, but they weren't nothing either. They stood in formation, facing a single grave that was taller than the rest, its inscription carved deeper, as if someone wanted to make sure it wouldn't be forgotten. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my throat. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't, not yet. I reached into my coat pocket, fingers closing around the old brass bugle I had brought with me. It had belonged to my great-grandfather, a relic of wars long past, its surface worn smooth by time. I lifted it to my lips and played. A slow, mournful tune, the kind that stretched across battlefields and echoed through the air long after the last soldier had fallen. The notes drifted through the cemetery, curling between headstones, wrapping around the shadows like a lullaby. The drum beats faltered, then ceased. The whispers softened, then faded. And one by one, the figures turned toward me. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They only watched, their hollow eyes reflecting something ancient, something tired. And then, as the last note of my song hung in the air, they saluted. A cold shiver ran down my spine as they began to dissolve, fading into the night like mist in the morning sun. The wind carried the last traces of their whispers away, leaving only silence behind. But it wasn't the heavy, haunted silence I had felt before. It was lighter, peaceful. I lowered the bugle and exhaled. The air smelled different now, cleaner, less burdened. I took one last look at the cemetery before turning back the way I had come, stepping carefully over the graves. As I reached the rusted gate, I glanced over my shoulder. The cemetery stood quiet beneath the moonlight. The headstones still. The battle finally over. I walked away knowing I would never speak of what I had seen. Some things weren't meant to be explained. Some stories belonged only to the dead. In the autumn of 1987, I arrived in the quiet town of Hollow's End, a place tucked between the dense forests of Maine, where the trees whispered secrets and the air carried an unshakable stillness. I had taken a temporary position at St. Mark's Chapel, an old stone church whose steeple had long since leaned slightly to the left, like an old man with a weary back. The congregation was small, mostly elderly folks who had lived in the town their entire lives. The church itself was undergoing long overdue renovations, and that's how I found it, the hidden room that no one had spoken of, sealed away as if it were never meant to be found. It was a cold afternoon when I discovered the door. It was tucked beneath the rotting choir loft, nearly invisible behind a collection of forgotten hymnals and discarded wooden panels. It wasn't on any blueprint or record, but it was there, its frame warped and barely hanging onto its rusted hinges. A heavy layer of dust coated the handle, as though it hadn't been touched in generations. The moment I pulled it open, a gust of frigid air spilled into the nave, carrying the scent of damp earth and something older, something wrong. The basement was small, the only light filtering through a set of narrow dirt-streaked windows. My flashlight's beam cut through the dimness, revealing forgotten relics, warped pews, shattered stained glass, ancient hymnals stacked in forgotten piles. But then I saw the objects that did not belong. Jars of dried herbs sealed with wax, amulets carved from bone, and old leather-bound books that bore symbols I didn't recognize. They sat in a careful arrangement, not abandoned, but placed with intent. Curiosity and something deeper, something I refused to name, drove me forward. One of the books was marked with a sprig of blackthorn, brittle with age. When I opened it, the words seemed to crawl on the page, ink spreading like veins. The passage described rituals of protection, incantations to ward off curses, and a warning. Disturbing these objects could wake something that had long been put to rest. I told myself it was just folklore. The rational part of me, the part that clung to reason, dismissed the warning as old superstition. So I catalogued the objects, one by one, and with each piece I moved, the air grew heavier, the silence deeper, like the church itself was holding its breath. Then the nightmares began. At first they were fleeting, whispers in the dark, shadows shifting where no light had changed. But soon they grew worse. I dreamt of a man in a black coat, his face hollow, his eyes nothing but voids. He stood at the foot of my bed, watching. In the dream I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. When I woke, the sensation of his presence lingered, a suffocating pressure in my chest. That's when I found the name, the Ashworths, a family that had lived on this land centuries before, their story ending in blood and disappearance. Rumors whispered that Elias Ashworth, the patriarch, had dabbled in things better left alone. He had tried to protect his family from an unknown force, but his methods had backfired, leading to tragedy. And then one night, the entire family vanished, their house abandoned and left to rot until the church was built atop its bones. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight slanted through the stained glass windows, I made a decision. I would end this. I would destroy the artifacts before whatever slumbered beneath the church fully woke. I carried the books, the herbs, the amulets, all of it, to the old stone furnace in the basement. As the fire roared to life, the air around me shifted. The whispers grew into screams, voices rising in anguish, in anger. The pages curled in the heat, blackening, disintegrating, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, The voices stopped. The air lightened, the heavy weight pressing on my chest lifted. The fire sputtered, then died, leaving only embers and silence. When I stepped out of the basement, I knew something had changed. The church felt lighter, as if a presence had finally been laid to rest. But deep inside, a question gnawed at me. Had I done the right thing? Or had I destroyed something that was never meant to be disturbed? In the following weeks, the renovations continued without incident. The nightmares faded, the shadows no longer whispered. Yet every now and then, when I stand alone in the empty chapel, I swear I hear a voice, a soft, distant sigh, like a secret breathed into the dark. And I wonder if, one day, the past will find its way back again. In the autumn of 1976, I found myself in Blackwood Bay, a sleepy coastal town that reeked of salt, damp wood, and old secrets. My cousin, Father Declan, had taken ill and asked me to watch over St. Gabriel's Church until he recovered. I wasn't a priest, not even close, but the place was more of a relic than an active parish. A few locals still attended Mass out of habit, but most just saw the church as another piece of the past, like the weather-beaten docks or the century-old cannery now sinking into disrepair. The church sat on a hill overlooking the sea, and behind it lay the cemetery, a slanted patch of land where the dead had been buried so long ago their names had started to disappear from the headstones. Among them stood one grave taller than the rest, a statue of a man carved from stone, standing defiantly against the wind, eyes fixed on the restless waters below. I had heard whispers about the man it represented, Captain Elias Grayson. During his life, he'd been a sea captain of some renown, a protector of the town, and in death he had become something more. The locals called him the Watchman. They said when a storm approached, his spirit would rise from the grave, lantern in hand, warning those who dared to listen. I didn't put much stock in ghost stories, but I've always had a weak spot for folklore, so I spent my first evening wandering the cemetery, tracing the worn epitaphs with my fingers. The wind came in off the sea, thick with the smell of brine, and in the distance I swore I heard something. Not quite a voice, not quite the wind, but something caught between the two. A murmuring that seemed to slip between the headstones, too deliberate to be random. That night the radio crackled with news of a storm brewing far off the coast, one that could hit by morning. I secured the windows of the church and tried to settle in, but sleep didn't come easy. Around midnight I woke to a sound. Footsteps on gravel, slow and steady. I crept to the window, expecting to see some drifter wandering the cemetery. But what I saw instead made my breath hitch. The statue of Captain Grayson wasn't standing where it should have been. It was further down the hill, closer to the cliffside. But that wasn't possible. Statues don't move. My mouth went dry. The lantern he held in his stone grip had a glow now, a flickering, impossible glow, and at his feet the mist churned like something alive. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the figure turned. I stumbled back, heart hammering. No, I had to be seeing things. The shadows, the lightning, it was all playing tricks on me. But the air had changed, thick and electric, the kind of air that comes right before something terrible happens. I grabbed an oil lamp and stepped outside, the wind shoving against me like an unseen hand. Rain stung my face as I made my way down the hill, feet slipping in the slick grass. When I reached the captain's grave, I could feel it, the weight of something watching, something ancient and restless. Then I saw them. Beyond the cliff, just where the black sea met the sky, figures moved in the mist. Men in tattered coats, their faces pale and empty. Their hands reached toward the land, toward me. They weren't just lost souls, they were trapped, drowned men who had never found their way home. The sea takes them too soon, a voice whispered, low, insistent, not spoken, not in the way humans speak, but inside me, rattling my ribs. I turned, and there he was, Captain Grayson, no longer stone but flesh and bone, his weathered face twisted with sorrow. His lantern flickered in the dark, casting long shadows. He pointed to the sea, his meaning clear. They wanted peace. They wanted rest, and they weren't going to get it. Not unless someone helped them. I didn't know what to do. I'm no priest. I don't have holy water, sacred rites, any of that. But I did the only thing I could. I knelt in the rain, pressed my hands to the cold earth, and whispered a prayer. Not just for them, but for every soul the sea had ever swallowed. The wind howled one last time, then fell silent. The rain slowed. One by one, the figures in the mist turned, retreating into the tide. The captain lingered for a moment longer, his gaze locked on mine, something like gratitude in his eyes. Then he too was gone. By morning, the storm had veered away from Blackwood Bay. The locals called it luck. I knew better. When I left the town a week later, I took one last look at the cemetery. The captain's statue was back in place, standing firm against the sea, but something was different. His face, once grim, now held the faintest trace of peace, and just before I turned away, I swear I saw a light flicker inside his lantern, one last time. The wind hit me as soon as I stepped off the dirt road, brushing the back of my neck like the cold hand of a stranger. It was the first week of November, too late for summer, not yet enough for winter, and the trees were emptying their guts into the ground. The smell of wet leaves and something older, something like decay, hung thick in the air. My boots crunched over the brittle grass as I made my way toward the iron gate that separated the living from the dead. Old Town New Haven, if you could even call it that, had a history too twisted for the locals to talk about. Half the town had forgotten what happened here, and the other half wished they could. The cemetery was known as Shadow Hill, tucked away behind a forgotten hillock where no one went, unless they were looking for something lost, or something that shouldn't have been found. I wasn't sure why I came. It wasn't really to pay respects to the dead. It was something else, something that gnawed at me, something I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the rumors of men who had fought, not in wars that were written about in books, but in secret battles, long buried and erased from history. The kind of battle where men bled and screamed in trenches, forgotten, names lost in the dark soil. The ghosts of those who had fought, I figured, were probably the ones who never wanted their stories to be told, and I figured that made me the fool for coming. The gate screeched in protest as I pushed it open, a rusty protest that sent a shiver up my spine. Behind it, the cemetery stretched out like a sea of broken stone. The tombstones weren't in neat rows like you'd expect, but clustered together in strange patterns, leaning this way and that. There were names carved in them, but the letters were nearly impossible to read, worn down over the centuries. I walked among them slowly, careful not to trip on the roots that snaked up from beneath the earth. It was quiet at first, too quiet. But that was when I heard it. A slow, low thud. At first I thought it was my imagination. The wind does strange things, you know, whistling through cracks, making noises it shouldn't. But the thud came again, unmistakable now, a rhythmic beat, like a drum. My feet froze in place. My eyes darted toward the darkening corners of the cemetery. No one was supposed to be here, but the sound, deep and resonant, seemed to come from the farthest end of the graveyard. I should have turned back. Any sane person would have. But there was something magnetic about the sound. It was hollow, aching, like the cry of a wounded animal. And despite every bone in my body screaming at me to leave, my feet carried me forward, drawn to the center of it. And then, through the trees, I saw them, figures, tall, thin, barely human. They flickered in and out like shadows cast by a flickering candle, shifting in the moonlight. Their movements were stiff, almost mechanical, but their presence, it was palpable. These weren't people, not in the way you or I would understand. They were something else. Soldiers, maybe. Not the kind that marched into battle, but the kind that had been forgotten by time. They stood facing a grave that rose taller than the others, as if the earth itself had raised it higher for some unspoken reason. The inscription was deep, deeper than any other tombstone I had seen, etched into the stone like someone wanted to make sure it would be remembered. I shouldn't have stayed. The dread was thick in the air like fog that creeps in before you even notice. But I couldn't move. My hands fumbled inside my coat, fingers grazing the smooth surface of an old pocket watch my grandfather had given me. I didn't know why I brought it, but something told me it would help. Or maybe I just needed something to hold on to. I wound it up, the ticking loud in the silence. And then, without thinking, I raised it to my lips. The song came unbidden, slow and mournful. It wasn't a tune I knew, but it felt familiar, like it had been waiting for me all along. The notes echoed through the cemetery, floating like mist weaving between the stones. The drumbeats faltered, their rhythm slowing, and then there was silence. The whispers stopped. The air grew still. And then, one by one, the figures turned toward me. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But their eyes, those empty, dark eyes, stared through me as if they were seeing something I couldn't. And for a moment I could swear I felt the weight of their centuries of silence pressing down on me. And then, as the last note of the song drifted away, they did something unexpected. They raised their arms, a salute. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble. The air felt thinner, lighter, as if the burden that had been hanging over this place had been lifted, even if just for a moment. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures began to dissolve. Their outlines blurred, fading into the shadows until there was nothing left. The wind picked up again, carrying away the last traces of their presence. I lowered the pocket watch and exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The cemetery had returned to its silence, but it was different now. Peaceful even. I turned and left without another glance back. I didn't need to see it anymore. As I stepped back through the gate, I felt a strange weight lift from my shoulders, but I knew deep down that the cemetery was no longer just a place for the dead. It had become something else, something I couldn't explain. And as I walked away, I promised myself I'd never speak of what I saw that night. Some things, after all, are better left to the dead.